When we think of our world from a global perspective, it's very easy and convenient for us to think of it as a sort of a monolithic sphere. It's very uniform in appearance and very easy for us to imagine. But the reality of it is that we know that the world is not uniform and that it's divided physically. The oceans divide and separate us into different land masses. And within that landmass, the boundaries are further divided by political aspirations, religious affiliations, physical boundaries. And that becomes a very convenient way for us to parcelize our world and for us to conveniently live and group ourselves together. And that's worked fairly well for most of civilization, where the population has continued to grow fairly steadily, but at a very gradual rate. That isn't until about the Industrial Revolution where the population continued to, or escalated exponentially, and over the last couple hundred years has grown at a time about 800% of its rate prior to that time period. And we've relied on cities to be our solution on how we deal with this increased population density. In 1950, as megacities started to become reality, there were a handful of cities across the world that were handling this increased densification. New York, London, Moscow, Shanghai, Tokyo, to name a few. And as the populations continued to escalate, more cities came online in the same manner. And not only did more cities come online that were handling this increased density, but those same cities continued to increase in their own populations and their own density. We saw this slide in Peter's presentation, but you can understand why a megacity would be vital in a global atmosphere. When you look at the GDP of these cities, when you consider that the GDP of Tokyo is larger than all of India, or the GDP of the Shanghai region is larger than Moscow. This map that we looked at earlier of nations dividing the world into convenient parcels almost becomes childlike when we look at the cities and the impact that they have and the power and economic density that they start to yield across the world. And the cities that have historically continued to absorb this population and grow exponentially were based on a model of a monocentric city, where you had a central business district and more people came, and that circling of the central district continued to grow and grow outside the rings of the walled city until you expanded to a point where you started to build up. And that model is clearly one that's not going to work for a population that increases as rapidly as the world's population increases now. This model of a polycentric city, as we're seeing here in the Pearl River District, is the model that we think is going to allow us to continue growing. But what's interesting to me in the Pearl River District is you can consider New York to be polycentric as well. When you combine with DC, when you combine with Philadelphia, Boston, and we saw earlier this idea that the connection points between these are not that much different than the connection points of the cities in the Pearl River District. But in the Pearl River, despite the environmental impact of densification, it's built on a number of rivers coming into the delta. And the estuary not only creates a remarkable landscape, but it creates these waterways that carve their way through and vein the land. And it does two things simultaneously. It divides it into smaller parcels, but it also connects it back together. And historically, the settlements in this area, Shenzhen is said to exist for the last 30 to 40 years, but there have been settlements here for much longer than that. They've just been much smaller villages that worked in isolation, but yet worked together through a connection of waterways. And Guangzhou, as we heard earlier, was always the historic center of this area. It controlled the waterways from the outside as we brought trade coming in through the ocean up to Guangzhou and then through the rivers up into the mainland of China until the port cities were moved out to the seaside with Macau and Hong Kong, which eventually became Portuguese and British settlements. And when the special economic zones were created and Shenzhen and Zhuhai affiliated themselves with the connections between Macau and Hong Kong, allowing the trade to happen to the outside world again, the development of these cities became very important. But Shenzhen did not grow in isolation. It grows as part of this network. And that's what's interesting to me is that the landscape of the Pearl River District is what is a metaphor of how these cities have grown. They do not work in isolation, but they work not only, they don't work in isolation, but they work as a contained network of cities interconnected to each other, allowing each city to focus on what it is that they do best and rely on each other to ultimately become this mega city. And within that, the cities themselves are connected, but the city plan itself is also polycentric. Shenzhen was always planned as a series of clusters of business districts. It was never a city center that continued to grow outward. And I think that is why one of the reasons it was able to grow so quickly. Between Luhao and Nanshan and now in Qinghai Bay, where we're going to look at a project, these series of nodes that allow the business districts to grow simultaneously, as opposed to waiting for the central district to grow and continue to circle itself. We can now develop these business districts simultaneously, allowing for the mass urban migration to happen at such a rapid rate. But the key to that is that it's planned appropriately and connected together through mass transit. In Qinghai Bay, their vision is to create a new economic zone which allows the trading of the RMB. So it internationalizes the China currency. And their vision for that is a new Manhattan of China, essentially. This is a current vision or a current photograph of what that site looks like. But as we know in China, these things grow very rapidly. And to take an area of reclaimed sea land and develop it into the Manhattan of China takes a lot of vision of what this quality of life can be and how we achieve it. One of the things that's important is that the programs for these spaces, even though it's a financial district dedicated to the trade of currency, is that it's not just a business district. It's a self-contained village, almost, similar to the villages of the Pearl River District, that enables a business district to happen, but also one that has an activity, has a quality of life. It supports retail, it supports living, it supports hotels. It's a self-contained entity that then is developed and is allowed to connect to the intermodal systems that connect all through the delta. Our vision for a project like this is not just a city center, but it includes elements of the natural landscape of Shenzhen. Because it's a new city that's being developed without any references, it also includes an element of stability. If you're going to build a financial district, it needs to have a reputation as something that's stable and solid. And the idea of the stone piers is a metaphor for how we see these buildings being constructed. But you also need to have a combination of landscape, a combination of financial stability, but a quality of life. And that's critical to creating these urban developments that have a Manhattan skyline, but also have a urban realm that people will want to come to and will inhabit and will create vibrant communities with pedestrian scaled amenities. So when we plan these areas and we think about these buildings that are going in here, we think about them at two different scales. The city urban scale, the macro scale, but also the micro scale of the pedestrians walking through there. We think about how the towers are situated so that they have views out to the distance and they're not looking at each other. They can get sunlight. They hold the city edge and they define the urban environment. But at the same time, they create areas of a more relaxed ability to stroll through a pedestrian area. Here's a view looking down of a rendering of this development, and you can see how the towers are situated to hold that urban edge and create the financial district, but also how that we call it the financial canyon winds its way through the center of it, a more naturalistic area, a more meandering path with landscape and activities. A rendering of the exterior, which shows a very strong tower coming to the ground with a lobby that faces to the street, appropriate for a financial district. But on the inside, a more vibrant retail community, and you can see that it has public spaces where people can gather, they can have performances, you can eat dinner, you can have conversations with friends and meet for coffee. And critical to that whole concept working is that you have the ability to then connect to other parts of the city, that these don't work in isolation. In this project, we have 2 subway trains that connect to the intermodal system, and they allow you to connect not only to the other clusters of the central business districts of Shenzhen, but also onto the other cities of the Pearl River District. This project in Guangzhou is in the new central business district, the Pearl River New Town. And you can see it's also very centrally located, and it's able to connect to a lot of the amenities of Guangzhou. And it's situated around a new urban park that was developed right off the Pearl River. This is a view from 2006, and you can see that the master plan had already been started, that the roadways had been constructed, some of the buildings had started to go in. Our tower sits where the red square is. This is a single point tower in this project. And the idea of this park is that it provides a natural landscape. It's a central business district, but it's focused around a park. And it provides a natural landscape to balance that quality of life with business as well as the pedestrian amenities that people want to have. Underneath that layer of park is a retail corridor at the B1 level that connects to all the surrounding buildings and provides amenities for the people coming to this area. Below that, a layer of parking, and then most importantly below that is the subway connection that again takes you out to the rest of the city. So while we're a new central business district, we have connection to all the rest of Guangzhou. Here you can see a map of those train lines and how they connect to us. This is a view also from about 2006, looking out towards the Pearl River. You can see the Canton Tower in the distance just starting to go up. Our site is the one with the blue roof construction trailers there to the right. And this idea of the rapid growth of China and the organic nature of this site, but the renewal of these business districts, so the renewal of the city, not abandoning the city, but the renewal of it and adding to it and continuing to have it grow inspired us. And our metaphor for this tower was bamboo and the organic and rapid nature that bamboo grows. And we used that as a metaphor for how we would articulate the tower. We started with an extruded shape, and then we carved into the sides of the building, but not in a random methodology. It was one that was respective of the program inside the tower. So that as we divided the tower into its programs, we identified this to the outside world through these carves and enabled them to understand how the tower was stacked internally. picture on the right shows the finished product or the finished building, and on the left you can see the section. Ultimately, the program was office tower with a hotel, a Park Hyatt hotel at the top of the building. And beyond the carves that identified this nature of organic growth, there was also the way that we articulated the facade. And you can see here at the base of the building is a high level of stainless steel that becomes very dense, and it stretches and elongates as it goes up, again for that aspiration of the growth of China, as well as the respect for the type of buildings and the sheer amount of energy that's required for them as they come to the ground and meet the street. This is a view of the multi-level lobby inside the Park Hyatt at the top of the building, which is important to us that there's not only a physical connection of these buildings to the rest of their community at grade, through the transit system, but also an aspirational vision, an aspirational connection to the rest of the city. Moments where you're allowed to participate in the view of the city that you only see from the ground plane, whether it's in the lobby or in this project we have a rooftop deck where you can actually go outside and enjoy a drink and see the city in a way that you would never be able to in any other way. The last project we'll look at is a neighboring city in Foshan that has very similar aspects to the Qinghai Bay. It's very close to the central district, which is a little bit different. This is sort of a revitalization of the city center. An infill project as opposed to a brand new central district that's being connected. But programs are very similar, where we have office buildings, we have retail, there's residential. Again, it's a self-contained community so that there is a 24-hour life and that it can be a village amongst to itself. Again, our aspirations were to create something that had respect for nature, that allowed natural light and fresh air, and allowed the building to have an articulation that enabled this to happen. And again, as we plan these cities, as we plan these developments, what's important to us is that they have a proper thought about how a city comes together, respecting the street edge, allowing views and vistas for each of the towers and the way they're situated on the site, but always respecting that human scale at the pedestrian level and allowing activities to happen for people to incorporate in their daily lives. This is a view looking down, and you can see the towers respecting the street edge, the residential pulled away from that major artery to give it a little more quietness, and then having the retail interspersed with the commercial district. Urban plazas that allow groups to gather and meet, and then towers that anticipate the growing demand of the world's population. This is an image showing graphically the world's population growing and how that impacts the settlements of the world. Again, they're not uniformly distributed across the entire planet. They're isolated into these megacities and become very powerful economic elements. And that metaphor of the Pearl River District and how the estuaries vein the land and create these isolated moments that then are reconnected through the waterways is an important one as we think about how our cities can grow and accommodate this large increasing population in a way that we can create polycentric cities, not only that are connecting city to city to city, but have isolated central business districts that can connect together within the city and create the larger megacities of the future. Because as we know, the oceans may divide us and boundaries may be created for nations, but our world is not isolated. It is very well connected, whether it's through the transportation systems that we use to reconnect all of these cities together, or just the digital and whether it's the digital or the airline or the energy networks that connect us all together and consolidate at those mega cities.